and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the National Museum of the United States Navy. I'm David Barker, an educator here. I am letting you know that we are recording this, and as long as the audio isn't too overwhelmed with the overheads, we will be putting this on our Facebook and our YouTube page. Thank you for coming to our brown bag brief. Denise will be introducing our speakers. Thank you very much.
So good morning, everybody. We're here to brown bag lunch. It's called Identity and Belonging, a conversation with Vice Admiral Tressler and Sam Cox, Rear Admiral retired. But before we talk about the conversation today, I'm just going to put a plug in for this most amazing building that we're in today. So welcome to the National Museum of the U.S. Navy. It's been here for many, many, many years, and we host a lot of super cool events. So I'm going to list a couple of them, so hopefully you'll come back and join us. So in December, on the 7th, we're hosting Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, and Dr. Kevin McDonald will be talking about the USS Arizona and the Navy Band. In January, Eddie Valentin will be giving a curator talk of Arming the New Navy. And in March, we're going to hear from Commander Billy J. Farrell, the first CEO of the Constitution. So please come back to these events, because this is your Navy, so please join us in learning about it. But today, we're going to be having a conversation with Vice Admiral Tressler. Okay, the gentleman to my left. Vice Admiral Tressler has served in his current capacity as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare and Director of Naval Intelligence since June 5th, 2020. As the DCNO for Information Warfare, Vice Admiral Tressler is the Principal Advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations regarding information, command and control, networks, cybersecurity, intelligence, electronic warfare, battlespace awareness, and precision navigation. He previously served as the Director of Future Plans of the United States Navy. And Vice Admiral Tressler is a member of the Cherokee Nation and was raised in Oklahoma. He graduated from Miami High School in 1981, and he earned a BS degree in mechanical engineering from Oklahoma State University, and later received his master's in managerial economics from the University of Oklahoma in 1992. Now I'm going to introduce my boss. So Rear Admiral Sam Cox serves as the Director of the Naval History and Heritage Command and Curator of the Navy. Okay, folks, he has the coolest job ever. Okay, you are responsible for the Navy museums. This museum plus all the museums around the country, art and artifacts collection and research library, and 150 million pages of the archives. That's 150 pages. Oh, and a library that's 220 years old. Okay, this is your Navy, and my boss is responsible for its history. So my boss entered the Navy from Hoffman Estates, Illinois, and he graduated with distinction from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1980, winning the Trident Scholar Prize for his independent research project entitled U.S. Foreign Policy and Naval Strategy in China 1945 to 1950, as well as the prize for history major with the highest standing. Now, my boss, Admiral Cox, has served a 37-year naval career. He served as an intelligence officer, retiring in November 2013 as a senior naval intelligence community leader, and from both command of the Office of Naval Intelligence and as director of the National Maritime Intelligence Integration Office. He previously served as the Director of Intelligence J2, U.S. Cyber Command. His first major command tour was as commander of the U.S. Central Command Joint Intelligence Center. So with that, please welcome Vice Admiral Tressler and Admiral Sam Cox. It's going to be a fantastic conversation this morning. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Well, it turns out it's a real job. Yeah, it is really cool. And this is one of the really cool things, is to be able to, sit down and chat with someone who, not only about naval history, but frankly, someone who's making naval history. Based in your position, you're now tied with J.J. Clark, the senior most Native American in the U.S. Navy. And his 4 stars was actually what was called a tombstone promotion, which means in honor of his service during World War II. Officers who received medals for valor were promoted 1 rank when they retired. Didn't get any extra money or anything like that, but they got the extra rank to go on the tombstone. that program ended in 1959, so J.J. Clark was one of the last. For those who don't know, in fact, you boned up on it, so you may be able to tell more about Admiral Clark than I can. But I think we first met it was either ACES or a SAGE conference at the American Indian Science and Engineering Society or Society of American Government Employees. I don't remember whether it was San Diego or Tulsa. It might have been both, for all I knew. But it was really cool for me to see a Native American in that position, because I've been going to those things for several years, and it's well, let me back up a little bit and tell you how I wound up there. When I made flag, the Navy was doing a really big push on diversity. And every flag officer was given this list of events. And each flag officer was supposed to go to at least 2 major diversity events each year. And when you get this list and you're looking at it, and it goes Hispanic officer preferred, female officer preferred, African American officer preferred. And my reaction is like, well, now I know how it feels, buddy. You know. But Native Americans, they didn't specify who they wanted. Plus, I had an interest in Native American history going back pretty far. Once I realized that it was very different than what I was taught in school, and in most respects, a lot worse than what I was taught in school. So one. It's amazing, given the history, that Native Americans choose to serve under the flag of the United States. That's an amazing thing that this country should be grateful for. But I started going to these, conventions 2 each year, one SAGE, one ACES, and they were great events. A lot of still have a lot of good friends from doing it, but it was not the kind of group where you can go and say, hey, I'm from Washington and I'm here to help. And it doesn't have quite the same ring to it within this group. So it took me several years of just working the groups. And I got opening night front plenary session building in 2011 at the ACES conference in Minneapolis. And I told the story of Ernest Evans during, hopefully anyone in naval history already knows, but we can go into that in a bit. And the group was about, 700 students and 300 engineering science professionals. None of them had heard the story before. And by the time I was done, I got this roaring standing ovation that blew the roof off the place. I mean, the kids were like tears coming down their eyes, because they had never heard this incredible story of the first Navy, U.S. Navy to win or be awarded a Medal of Honor, and they were just amazed by it and the pride that was there. And even afterwards, I had Ernest Evans' great grandnephew come up, and he was my grandmother's brother, and I had no idea. And so I think it's important for us to, one, get this history out there. There's pluses and minuses within the Navy. I think there's more pluses than in the overall history of the U.S. and Native Americans, but we can get into that. So I'm probably jamming the airways here long enough. Sir, you're senior. Welcome any thoughts you have on how we get this going and where you want to go.
Sure, allow me to participate. Thank you for doing it here and maintaining this great, fabulous facility here in the, 10 Navy museums we have nationwide. Just incredible. And I got here a little early today and was able to walk around and just be reminded of all of the history. And then just the fact of what we're going to talk about today, I think, with Native American Heritage Month, and I see my undersea things back there, I see some space back there, just all these things that I deal with right now throughout my career, the large Venn diagram of interests are all coming together. But you had it right. That's the first time we met, that 2011 event where you talked about Ernest Evans. That was fascinating. And I got to tell you, I started going to the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, the ACES events, somewhat reluctantly. So we talk about Native American Heritage Month, and you know, during that push, I think under Admiral Mullen's tenure as CNO, wanting to make the Navy look like, you know, America. The diversity was not quite represented right, from African American, Hispanic, female, etc. He wanted to, I think we called it, you know, he wanted the Navy of 2035, he wanted, you know, to proportionally represent Americans. See, he really pushed for that. And so, at the time, even young Captain Trussell, you know, there was a push. Hey, it says in your record here, you're Native American or have some Native American background. We need you to go start participating in some of these events. I didn't grow up considering myself Native American. I grew up, look at me, I'm a goofy-looking kind of old white guy, middle age. Maybe middle age is even a little generous at this point. But I really hadn't participated. Now, I come from northeast Oklahoma. I mean, that is you know, that is Indian territory, you know, until Oklahoma became a state. And so the heritage, the tradition, the history was all around me, but something we took for granted. And just wasn't raised to think like that. So a lot of people ask me about my background, what does it mean to you, and how did that influence? And well, it didn't. That was just part of, that was the, if there was a minority where I'm from, it was Native Americans. And in that area, it was just kind of small area, small town, northeast Oklahoma. So when the Navy, you know, outreach office was encouraging me to come and start participating in the ACES events, I was a little reluctant. I didn't know a lot about my heritage. I was a little weak on the history of the Cherokee Nation. And but I went, and I was a little worried I was going to stick out like some imposter. But that's not the case. It's just not the case. And you know, being Native American is what the tribe designates, and it's really less about blood quantum, something that the government invented, quite frankly, to help get around some treaties and so forth. I go into a lot about that. Now, I might here in this session, but I always say Native American history is part of American history. And I've had the privilege this month of speaking at the Office of Director of National Intelligence and over at the Defense Intelligence Agency on some things. And that's kind of the background I go into. And sometimes I tell sort of, you know, my story, a very small, you know, amount of my background. You have to go back 246 ancestors and get to my fourth great-grandmother to get to a full-blood Cherokee Indian. Judith Suta McGee, shortened the Indian part of her name. But she came over on the Trail of Tears, 1838, 1839. And that is a fascinating story of not only the Cherokee, but the 5 civilized tribes, the Native Americans. Those tribes, they're called civilized tribes because they actually tried to acculturate to what they called at the time the European ways, and in many cases were successfully doing it. And yet the westward expansion, the drive by states like Georgia and Tennessee to get more land and allow settlers more land. You know, when Andrew Jackson signed out the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the federal government started negotiating, started forcing and coercing those 5 tribes, and eventually moved them to Oklahoma. Over a period of about almost the whole decade, the Cherokees were the last. But 60,000 were removed. About 10,000, and what they call the Trail of Tears, didn't make it. Among the Cherokees, 16,000 were rounded up by Winfield Scott in what is a 3 to 6 month voyage, I'll say, overland, up rivers, down rivers, to get from Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama area to Oklahoma. 16,000 were rounded up somewhat brutally, and then forced on the about 15 different caravans to Oklahoma, but only about 12,000 made it. The estimates are 2,000 to 4,000 perished. I'm sure some of those are just folks who escaped on the way, but all estimates are at least 2,000, if not up to 4,000, actually perished on the Trail of Tears. A total of 10,000 from the 5 civilized tribes. So a fascinating part, of American history that, even being from Oklahoma, we didn't talk about it a lot. It was in the history book. It was part of Oklahoma history, things like that. But I just didn't appreciate it. But over the last decade or so, I've done a lot of homework and learned a lot about that, that Trail of Tears area, the Indian movement. And just because it was a part of me, many parts of me in those 246 ancestors when you go back. And my story is not unique. That story is not unique. There are many other stories of the indigenous people that had events like that and how they were treated by the government, at the time. And so one of the things I usually ask audiences is, how many of you have Native American ancestors? Some number of people will usually raise their hands. And then I usually fire back and say, well, I bet half of you are wrong. At least half of you are wrong. And it's the half that didn't raise your hands. Because it's very hard, unless your entire family immigrated recently from another country, in the 1900s. If you look back, I would say it's very hard for somebody not to have Native American heritage in their background. And these days, it's very easy to search and look back. And I stumbled in to a group when I started researching that part of my family history. They've done all the work. They have ground out that history back to Judith Suta McGee, who was born in about 1817, and her family and their 10 children, and how they got to Oklahoma in the Trail of Tears, which side they fought for in the Civil War, how they participated in tribal politics and tribal government, and then down to my 2 times and 1 time's great-grandmother, my great-grandmother that I knew, and just fabulous history. So it's there, and I think every citizen of the United States, if they look back, the majority probably have some Native American heritage in it, and they fit into that fabric of American history in some way, not just Native American, but every other ethnic, cultural, and racial background we have. Is frankly, the most diverse nation in the world, and the one that people want to, come to and have flocked to for a couple of centuries.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because it's exactly what happened to me. On my mother's side, I'm Polish. On my father's side, despite the name of Cox, most of the ancestors are Hispanic. And they all insisted, going way, way back, that they were purebred Spanish. Because it was from Mexico. It's like, there's no Native American. We are Spanish. My sister took one of these, DNA tests, and it comes back, 5% Native American from Sonora, Mexico, which is exactly where you would have expected that to come from based on where they live. And it's like, I only discovered that, very recently. My sister discovered it. But going to, back to the Trail of Tears, if you ever have the opportunity to go to, New Etosha in Georgia, which was a Cherokee capital, it's laid out like any other small city at the time. Courthouse, school, they did everything they could to try to not completely assimilate, but to, bring, to live in harmony with European, immigrants, which, all of us are. And even when, Chief Sequoyah developed an actual alphabet, so that the language can be transliterated and written down, which is one of the challenges of a lot of Native American histories. It's all orally passed, and for historians who don't understand the language, also had a tendency in many cases not to believe it. Like a lot of things about the Battle of Little Bighorn, where if you actually go back and look closely at what the Indians said afterwards, it's more accurate than what people understood at the time, but they was kind of dismissed. It's just Indian history. But one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand about the Trail of Tears or don't know is that, Georgia wanted to evict Cherokee and send them off. And it was actually a very convoluted court case, but essentially it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee. And President Jackson that was his first, what Supreme Court army is going to enforce this. He basically blew off the Supreme Court ruling, and the Cherokee and along with other of the 5 civilized tribes, that were evicted from their lands in what was actually a horrible event. Something that our country, and as you mentioned, there's a lot more, like that. If you look closely at like the Sand Creek massacre in Colorado, it happened during the Civil War, actually. Colorado militia, and the accurate story is that they massacred a village of Cheyenne, Indians. And what made that even more tragic is that the chief, Black Cattle, had tried very, very hard to live in harmony with the Europeans who were coming in, to the point that some accounts say he even went to Washington, met with, Abraham Lincoln. We're not sure about that, but at some point he was given an American flag. It was told that as long as you fly this flag, over your village, you will be safe. And when the militia attacked the village, his people were gathered together under that flag as they were gunned down, women and children, by the Colorado militia. And so when you think of events like that, the fact that relatively quickly, by World War I time period, Native Americans were serving in significant numbers in the Navy in World War I, and to have made that transition from that kind of terrible event to be willing to serve under that flag is actually a pretty amazing story, in my view. But Native Americans have been serving in the U.S. Navy going back to the very beginning as scouts, river pilots. Some other Native Americans might have considered folks like that traitors to their people, but very complex. And then, another thing to think is I got to get a laugh when you hear these things out in the West, where you have people squabbling over whether the federal government has the rights to the land or the state has the rights to the land, or whether the ranchers have a right to the land. It's like who had it first. It's like, well, if you pick that scab, in almost every case you'll find a broken treaty between the United States and the Native Americans. So if you want to know, well, who was there first and who actually had claim to that land? And, the Europeans, well, the Indians didn't have a sense of ownership of land. That's not true. They didn't have a sense of individual ownership of land, but they certainly had a sense of tribal land. And they knew what was their land and what wasn't. In many cases, Cheyenne and Sioux and Crow would, intermingle and they live in relative harmony. Other places, Indians would fight and kill each other, over their tribal land. So very complex history, much more than people understand. But endlessly fascinating.
Yes, sir. You can go back to our Constitution, and in the early days of the formal United States, after our independence and victory over the British. But the Constitution, the initial Constitution had a few flaws. How it addressed slaves. I think it was 3/5 of a person when counting for taxation and other forms of counting for representation and so forth. Well, Native Americans were also addressed in there, but only for the purposes of taxation and representation, and weren't considered citizens at all. Just addressed them from a very business-like, how taxes would or would not be levied, I think. But George Washington, early on in his administration, every president, through the founding of the country through the 1800s, had to deal with the Indian problem, as it was referred to. George Washington said, George Washington, you know, were living today, and he worked over the Pentagon where I work now, a PowerPoint, you know, in 3 lines of effort. And what he would have presented, he said, here's what we have to do to deal with the Indian problem, quite frankly. And I'm paraphrasing how I read, you know, how he addressed this. But 1, they need to speak English. 2, we must convert them to Christianity. And 3, we need to teach them how to participate in a normal sort of European-based economy, trading, you know, goods and money and property. Well, you know, the 5 civilized tribes, they did a pretty good job of that. And specifically the Cherokee. So a lot of them became businessmen, you know, farmed land, built houses that looked a lot better, and some of the richer Cherokees lived better than the settlers around them or near their territory. Now, that wasn't all encompassing. Just like trying to describe America today, there's a spectrum of things. There were many who lived the old way and did not want to, but there were some who lived very high. If you look at portraits of Cherokee leadership from back in the 1820s, 1830s, we're still talking, you know, pretty old time, before removal. They put on very European, English, you know, white man style garb to have their portraits painted in. You look at, if you talk about Chief Ross, I think he was the chief of Cherokees for 38 years before removal and through the Civil War, and died shortly after the Civil War. He was actually only one-eighth Cherokee. He didn't speak Cherokee very well. He preferred to speak English because he was a little self-conscious about that. But the people wanted him to be chief because he could deal with the U.S. government, with the state governments. Just fascinating. So you know, the Cherokee themselves, for example, that I keep going back to, when you talk about Sequoyah inventing the Cherokee soliloquy, almost a party trick initially. It was hard to do it. He developed it, and the Cherokee's a hard language, supposedly. If you classify languages, supposedly a level 5 language. I'm not sure what that means, but that's hard. But he actually developed this writing, taught it to his daughter, and then he would almost like a party trick. He would have his daughter go down to the end of the hall there, and I'd have his buddies gather around and say, look, tell me what you want her to say. And he would write it out. He'd call the daughter over, and she would read out what he said. So very early form of communication for those that did not yet speak English or learn to read and write. And that's one of the reasons we have such good history of the Cherokees, is because there were a group of people very fanatical about getting a Cherokee and English newspaper and getting that up. But Sequoyah was one of the early settlers. When the government was trying to push the Southeast Native Americans to Oklahoma, some took the deal early and just moved west of the Mississippi and settled in Oklahoma. So he was what was called an early settler. After the Indian Removal Act of 1830, all it said was the federal government has the right, and the federal government should negotiate with the Native American tribes to swap land west of the Mississippi for land east of the Mississippi. Okay, so the federal government worked very hard initially in those negotiations, and probably very coercive negotiations, quite frankly. Cherokees were the last. But you mentioned the Treaty of New Dakota. A group of folks that did not represent the tribe said, it's coming. They've watched the other tribes in the area basically get coerced and removed, and they said, we need to get the best deal we can. It's coming. So in 1835 or so, they went, led by a fellow called Major Ridge, who fought with Andrew Jackson in the Creek Indian War. And he called himself Major. I don't know that he actually had that title, but he liked that title, and he became Major Ridge. A leading, older, authoritarian, sort of in the Cherokee government, part of the people. But he did not represent. So him, his son, his nephew, and about 20 others went to Washington, negotiated this treaty. Chief Ross, the Cherokee government at the time, said, hey, they do not represent us. That is invalid. The Senate immediately approved that treaty. So those who were part of the Treaty of New Dakota and several that followed them, they went ahead and moved to Oklahoma quickly. So they were the treaty settlers. So that's the second group showing up in Oklahoma. They swapped land. They took the best deal they could get. They were compensated somewhat, but they already moved. And that left about 16,000. In 1838, the government said, per the treaty, per the Indian Removal Act, per, time is up. General Winfield Scott, go. They sent him down there, and it was a very dramatic, somewhat brutal roundup of about 16,000 Cherokee. And it was done by just, it was knock on the door or kick open the door, let's go. I want to gather my stuff. No, let's go. Well, I've got stuff in the boat. Let's go. I have my husband's out in the wood hunting. Let's go. And it was like that. So it was not, what we would call responsible. It was not empathetic or sympathetic. It just happened. And then over the period of 1838. So now, Chief Ross and the rest of the Cherokees, now whittled down to 12,000 when they arrived. There are three factions: the old settlers, the treaty settlers, and now Chief Ross and the team. So there was even turmoil among the tribe when someone settled in Oklahoma of how to run the government. But as you mentioned, history is complicated. And it's not altruistic and pure in everything it does. Of those 16,000, 1,600 were African slaves. If you do some quick math, wait a minute. The Cherokees had slaves. A lot of those Indian nations down there had slaves to some degree. Other Indian slaves and African slaves. They had 1,600 slaves. If you do the math on that, that's actually a higher proportion than southern plantation owners had slaves. And they were part of that group that was moved to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. Well, that was an unusual, kind of an ugly artifact of history that, frankly, the Cherokee Nation and other tribes in Oklahoma had to deal with for the next 100 years on how to classify them as members of the tribe or not on subsequent treaties. Chief Ross, once he saw that it was inevitable, they are rounded up there and going to move. He did everything he could to negotiate to stay. When he saw it was inevitable, he said, well, they're going to hire somebody to move us because they have to provide transportation. They have to provide food and clothing in some case to get us there. It's a logistic operation. So what did the chief do? Well, he competed for the contract to move the Cherokee Nation, and he won. So that was probably, in the good spirit of, trying to help his people and doing it in the right way. But in the end, he made money off of that. So that's just a messy part of that history. Some interesting and good part of that history, though. That Treaty of New Dakota guaranteed that the Cherokee to have a representative to the House of Representatives. You probably haven't seen that or heard that on C-SPAN or you haven't. Well, it wasn't until 2 years ago when Chief Hoskin became Chief of the Cherokees that he pulled the treaty out and said, we are now going to exercise this right. And he sent Kimberly T. to Washington now as that delegate. So she is recognized. She is not yet seated. But I had a great meeting with her a couple of weeks ago when you mentioned Jocko Clark from World War II, where we presented the Cherokee Nation, and she represented the Cherokee Nation. We presented Admiral Clark's cruise book from World War II, and he was the commander of Carrier Division 13. We got to talk a lot about Jocko Clark's history. So she expects that the House will see her just like territories of the United States government have representatives and delegates. She will be the first that's not from a territory, that's from a sovereign, Indian nation. That before federally recognized Indian tribes in the United States.
Yeah, you talked about the complexity of history. If you go to when Native Americans first started serving in significant numbers in the U.S. Navy, it was during World War I. Even before they weren't citizens until 1922. but that was partly an outgrowth of what's known as the Indian boarding schools. And that's one of those things that it's not all black, not all white. It's very, interesting shades of gray involved with those. In that, if you try to look from the do-gooder European side, it's, well, in order for the Native Americans to assimilate into the rest of society, you need to take them out of the reservation, put them in school, teach them English, teach them, Western ways, and then they'll be able to better function within society. The flip side of that is, you suppress their language, you suppress their culture, you take them away from their families in doing so. So you have this very, opposite things working at the same time. And a lot of the Native Americans that came into the Navy were actually in World War I, were coming from those boarding schools in that they had been taught English. They were accustomed to working with other Europeans. And at the same time, there was a way to get out of those schools quickly. A lot of them, were able to get out before they graduated and joined the Navy during World War I. So it's this yin yang, good and bad. I think nowadays most people consider those schools to be bad, especially if you heard about the ones up in Canada. I mean, a lot of Native Americans died as a result because they weren't, they were taken from, you and I get, homesick when I went to Naval Academy, but it's not like I've been completely ripped off from my family and told that everything that came before, and you're completely unmoored from your culture and your history, causes, people to drink and suicide, whatnot. But some of them were actually able to very successfully leap out of that into the U.S. Navy. Now, the first Native American to graduate from the Naval Academy was J.J. Clark, who the press, his nickname was Jocko. He was never particularly fond of that. He actually preferred J.J. But once the press got hold of it, it stuck to him forever. But he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1917. And entered during World War I, during this period, but he was the first one to do it. He suffered discrimination, but not really to the extent that African Americans did when they first came into the Naval Academy. For whatever reason, it may have been his Cherokee heritage, and name. It's not Running Bear or something, it's Joseph Clark. He was able to fit in, he was able to graduate. He never hid his Native American heritage or anything. And then probably the next one was John Walburn. He was only 1/8, but it was Lakota Sioux. And he was the leader of Torpedo 8 at the Battle of Midway. And his whole squadron was lost, shot down, and only one pilot survived of the 15. But he was referred to as chief when he was at the academy, which me not knowing any better, but when I talk to people, it's kind of an insult to be called chief if you're not actually one. So, but he got it. But he also never hid his heritage. In fact, he was vociferous about it. He claimed that his Native American heritage was what allowed him to know where the enemy was. And at the Battle of Midway, while the rest of the Hornets Air Wing went off in the wrong direction, he went straight at where the Japanese were and had the misfortune to get there first by himself with no fighter escort and Enterprise and Yorktown's planes also wandering around lost. And whoever got the Japanese first was going to pay the price, and he did. But then Ernest Evans was Cherokee, half Cherokee, 1/4 Creek. the white in him was actually his grandfather, who married his grandmother to get her land allocation, and then dumped her after he got the land. So much for that part of his bloodline. When he served during World War II, he was the first Native American to be awarded a Medal of Honor for extremely courageous action at the Battle of Lake Gulf, the Battle of Samar, where he was the first destroyer in a small group that was escorting 6 escort carriers that was about to be overrun by 4 Japanese battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. And he realized that they couldn't outrun him, and without waiting for orders, he turned his ship, USS Johnston, and single-handedly did a solo daylight torpedo attack, which would be considered suicide by any tactical, and put a torpedo into the lead Japanese cruiser, knocked it out of the battle, was hit, ducked into a rain squall, at which time the American task force commander ordered 2 other destroyers and to charge, and 1 destroyer escort decided to go with them. So Ernest Evans came out of the rain squall and already badly damaged in order to support the attack by those other 3 ships. And later on in the battle, he disrupted Japanese cruisers firing on the escort carriers, and ultimately faked out the Japanese destroyers into shooting their torpedoes too early, which enabled the carriers to outrun them. Johnston was eventually sunk at the very end of the battle, and the Japanese were so amazed that they didn't expect that any American could show that kind of what they considered, samurai self-sacrificial courage, to the point that, one of the Japanese skippers, and I see people track down which skipper by name, who saluted the Johnston as it went down. Ernest Evans was believed to be the last person off the ship and was never seen again, so the award was posthumous. But, to me, I rank it, along with Samuel Eliot Morrison's book, The History of the United States Navy in World War II, as the most gallant action in the entire history of the U.S. Navy, and I would argue Morrison's probably right, but that kind of courage was just astonishing. And I think another point to be made, that even going back to the period after World War I, all the way through today, Native Americans served in the United States Navy. The percentage of them in the Navy is greater than their percentage of Native Americans in the population at large. So the flip side of Alvin Mullen saying he wants the Navy to look like the rest of the country would be, well, get rid of some enlisted Native American sailors because there's too many of them. I would argue that would not be the right thing to do. The challenge is in the officer corps, and the reason to my mind in that is that if a Native American stays in school, graduates from high school, gets into college, they're going to do fine for the most part. And the competition for the people who would be officers in the Navy from Xerox and IBM and anyone else is so intense. We're lucky to have you. Someone else probably could have snapped you up pretty quick if your country was an amazing thing.
Oh, thank you. I think that when the 2020 census is finally released, we're going to see that the different races, cultures, ethnicity that we consider minority are going to continue to be less and less minority. That's the trend in the demographics of the United States. I think right now it shows about between 1 and 2% identify as Native American. That's the same for the DoD and kind of the Navy as a whole. I do notice over on your faces of the deep, though, there you have just really important famous people in the Navy. You've got Jocko Clark up there. I think some have called him the Patton of the Pacific. He doesn't get enough press time as some of the other World War II heroes, I think. And I think Mike Bidler might have made up the name Patton of the Pacific in a documentary he helped participate in. But I think that's legitimate. When Nimitz calls you the fightingest admiral in the Pacific, that's a pretty high honor, and that probably ranks right up there with being termed the Patton of the Pacific. You talk about that Ernest Evans story. That is just tremendous. In 2019, the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the theme that year, No Higher Honor. And that battle off Samar that you talk about, where the USS Johnson with Ernest Evans in command, just incredible. And you know, why I really appreciate knowing you and you in this position, because I'm constantly reaching out. Hey, what info do you have on Jocko Clark? What info do you have on Ernest Evans? Because you can Google that stuff. You can go to Wikipedia, lots of information, great stories, all probably 99% accurate. But I get to check with Naval History and Heritage Command to make sure I got the facts straight before I'm repeating them publicly. You got another name on that wall, though, James E. Williams from the Vietnam War, boatswain's mate. He was on a small boat division, rivercraft in Vietnam. And if you go read his story, he's what they call the most highly decorated enlisted sailor in the Navy. And probably why classified, like he got the Medal of Honor, he had a Silver Star, and just you know, rose up. Probably could be or would be labeled the highest decorated ever. You had a couple of submarine COs like Gene Fluckey, who had my job back in the 60s, you know, as the Director of Naval Intelligence. But, you know, as a Medal of Honor and several Navy crosses and so forth that he was competing against. But, you know, if you look at the story of James E. Williams and what he did during the Vietnam War, this is a horrible reference. But if you want to read about a story of somebody that might have looked and fit like Rambo in the firefights he was in for that specific engagement, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. That was one of them. James E. Williams' story is tremendous. He's on the wall over there. He was a Native American. As I walk back in the museum here, because I'm always immediately attracted to the you know, the undersea stuff. You've got the Trieste and the Alvin back there, and of course I wanted to look at that a little bit as I'm walking around. I'm reminded, based on the history on the wall, well, hey, the 60s, when those things were going deep. The 60s were considered the age of space exploration. Well, that was the age of deep sea exploration, too, when we started developing deep sea diving bathyspheres and vehicles. And I'm sitting there looking at that. As I'm looking at space now, the big Venn diagram of, hey, there's a submarine up in space right now, Caleb Berry. Up at the space station. You know, I think we arrived the day before the Russians did that satellite test, which causes a little consternation, causing them all to take cover. But as I'm sitting there staring at the space display and thinking about that, hey, the first Native American in space was John Harrington. He was from Oklahoma. So I'm looking at this Venn diagram of all the things that touch me from Oklahoma. Native Americans, the seabed to space. The seabed to space is what we emphasize and focus on in information warfare right now, is mastering the spectrums, the acoustics, the radio frequency, those things that interfere and help identify or define how we move information. When I say the seabed to space, so that's why I was just fascinated quietly walking around this morning. And you can find Native Americans participating in every venue, every level, just like there are many other cultures, races, and ethnicities that make up this diverse Navy, that make up our diverse nation.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned James E. Williams, which is, you know, another case where it's not obvious, unless you know he's Cherokee, the name's not going to give it away. You know, and another one is Michael Thornton. There were 15 Medals of Honor for Navy during the Vietnam War, and 2 of them were Cherokee, James E. Williams and Michael Thornton. Michael Thornton was a SEAL who was awarded the medal in October, for the action in October 1972, one of the very last combat actions on our part during the war, when they had a navigational error. They were supposed to go in just south of the militarized zone to do a raid and there was a navigation layer, and they actually found themselves inside North Vietnam. And it was one hell of a firefight, getting out of there. But so, 3 Native Americans have been awarded the Medal of Honor in the Navy. Evans, Williams, and Thornton. And unless you knew, you wouldn't know they were Native Americans just by unless someone told you. The interesting thing about J.J. Clark, that the good, the bad. I mean, he was the fightingest admiral, if you will, and he proved it. He had one case where he took his carriers up to attack, Iwo Jima, Chichijima, and he was going with two carrier groups, and the other one, that commander was full of all kinds of excuses why the weather's too bad, the defenses are too bad. He did not want to go. And Clark was, well, I'm going. You can come with me or stay behind. That was followed by the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in which at the very end of it, U.S. carriers, which were then Task Force 58 under Admiral Mitchell, launched a very long-range, late afternoon strike on the Japanese fleet, which was actually at that point trying to get away. And they knew when they launched that they were going to come back to the carriers in the dark. And most of the pilots, in fact almost all the pilots, were not trained for nighttime recoveries. They could do pinky recoveries, and there was a little bit of light, but these guys were going to come back damaged, out of gas, because it was very long range, in the dark. And it was incredible that one, Mitchell made that decision, and two, the folks who flew on that mission, knowing what they were getting into, was just an awesome act of bravery. But on the way back, the history books will all say that, most of them anyway, is that Mitchell turned on the lights of the carriers in order to allow these carriers, at risk of being hit by submarines, but turned on the lights. Actually, when he gave that order, all the ships turned on their lights. Firing pyrotechnia was described as like a 4th of July, they kind of like overdid it. But if you go back and trace it, it's actually J.J. Clark and his carrier group turned on their lights first, and then he informed Mitchell that he had done it, and that's when Mitchell gave the order for everyone to light up. So, he actually did that first. Now, Mitchell had done that before. In fact, they make it like, well, no one ever thought about lighting up carriers. Mitchell had done it at Midway to get a late strike in the Hornet back. It actually was in U.S. Navy doctrine in order to do that if you needed to do that. But in this case, there was, the risk was such that, if he'd taken a torpedo in one of those carriers and you lost 3,000 guys on a carrier in order to save 300 pilots, history might have judged that whole thing very differently, but it worked, and they got away with it, and almost all the pilots either made it back or were rescued from the water the next day. But, it took real mixed company to, but bravery on the part of Clark in order to, I'm going to get these guys back safe and I'm going to turn on the lights.
Absolutely. Like I said, that Jocko Clark story is just tremendous, easy to follow him back, his heritage. Jocko Clark, from the Cherokee Nation. When you mention Ernest Evans, Eastern Banded Cherokee, what does that mean? That's roughly North Carolina, the folks that escaped to the hills and did not go. And so 3 separate bands, and I only mention that and bring that up just because of the fascinating, background of nothing is simple, black and white, 1 or 0, the spectrum of how when you look back over tribal history, all of it. I keep referring to the Cherokee just because that's what I know well, or relatively well, compared to all of the other 574 federally recognized tribes. They have their own stories, and if you look at maps of Oklahoma where I'm from 1840 to 45 to 50 to 55 to 60, it changes almost yearly based on them continuing to divide the land up. And oh, we did give you this, but we're going to divide it here, so we're bringing in another tribe here. And I think if you ever read the book Killers of the Flower Moon, fascinating book. I just read it on a whim. It's right about the Osage in Oklahoma in the early 1900s. And somehow J. Edgar Hoover made it into that story because the early days of the FBI and its predecessor, but how the Osage were taken advantage of because, they had a pretty sweet tract of land that was high in oil and other resources that people wanted to get their hands on. So there was some tremendously ugly practices, even flat out just marriages to get rights to land, and a lot of unexplained deaths. And they're actually filming that as a movie right now that I think will probably be fascinating. But I would just say, when people ask, what classifies as a Native American? Well, you're a goofy-looking middle-aged white guy. You said something about fifth-time great-grandmother is. Yeah, if you do the math on that, what does that mean? 1/64th of a blood quantum? Well, that's what my Bureau of Indian Affairs card says. And how did blood quantum? Who came up with that? Well, the government. Why did they come up with that? Because as westward expansion continued, and we're running out of places. Wait a minute, there's this nice Indian territory in Oklahoma. This Dawes Act of 1887 said, you know what? Those tribes, they don't divide land up into little squares like this and say, you own this one, you own. They just exist in large tracts of land and work and live amongst themselves. The government passed a law and said, they ought to individually own land so that they can sell it or trade for it if they choose. They can't do that now. Therefore, the lands should be divided up among the citizens of each tribe. Therefore, we're going to take censuses. Well, who's a member of the tribe? Well, that's why they came up with this blood quantum, because there was a lot of intermarriage at this point, among all tribes, and especially Cherokee part of that story. But so there was, frankly, 15 to 20 years of census taking and adjudication of who is a member of a tribe or not. And so one of the things they came up with which was just part of the documentation, was blood quantum, and started tracking. You go back to the Dawes Rolls of 1905. It's kind of where they snapped the chalk line, at least from the Cherokees, on who was a member. And so there's great detailed records and several censuses taken, in the late 1800s, early 1900s to try to get that. That's why there's such great records. Anytime the Army's involved, I kid my Army buddies, the only good thing about the Army showing up in the 1800s is they kept pretty good records. They like to write stuff down, so they helped out when they started removing some of these Indian nations. So that's why it's interesting. We say, what is a Native American? Am I really a Native American? Am I have such a small amount of blood? It's about the heritage. It's about the history. It's just about honoring the background you came, just like my family of blacksmiths that came from England, some that came over early on, one that's on the Mayflower. He was kind of one of these impressed individuals that was described as a scoundrel, but mine is not unique. Everybody has their own unique and interesting history if they look back into it. And these days in 2021 that we live in, with all the information available to us, sometimes for a small price, but just a lot of people have done the work for you if you plug into the right crowds and depending on your family lines. But if you look back, I bet a lot of them can find out you have some Native American heritage. If you dig into that, I bet somebody's already done the work for you. If you just plug in and find them, and you can learn a lot about at least one of the areas you might have come from, just like I have.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that, I would say that for whatever reason, the Cherokee are disproportionately represented in terms of medals of honor, within the United States Navy. But people from almost all the tribes served and have served If you include our brothers, the Marines, one of the flag raisers in the famous program in Iwo Jima, Ira Hayes, was a Pima Indian from Arizona. And, unfortunately, after the war, he succumbed to alcoholism, which is unfortunately a very common problem on reservations, even today. And he wound up dying of hypothermia, in a drunken state. But all different tribes have served. I guess we're running out of time.
Sir, it has been an amazing hour. Do you have maybe 1 or 2 minutes if anybody in the audience has any questions for you, sir?
Yeah, we can do that.
Does anybody here, because we've heard an amazing conversation over this past hour, does anybody have any questions for Vice Admiral Trustler? Or Admiral Cox? Okay. Well, sir.
Well, we answered all your questions.
You sure did, sir. You sure did. So, thank you.
Those two sure can talk a lot. Thank you.
Well, thanks for doing this. It's educational for me and also fun. And it's one thing I miss is, when I became an SES, I asked, hey, do SESs do these diversity events like I did as a flag officer? And I got this, apparently not. So, if I go to an ACES conference now, I got to pay my own way. But I did become a Sequoia Fellow. And went through the whole ceremony. I mean, it was actually very moving. And I sponsored 2 students every year to go to be Sequoia Fellows. And a little bit, I do my good deed. But it was sure a great opportunity to meet with those people and to get a better understanding of their history and heritage that you couldn't get just from reading history books, most of which are wrong. Squano, he didn't learn English from fishermen. He was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Spain and made his way to Europe and then back to the United States, back to Massachusetts. And by the time he got back, his entire village had been killed by the pandemic at the time. So he was the last one of his particular tribe. But, they didn't teach me that on the Thanksgiving myth when I was a kid. But, Native American history is in many respects very tragic. But, kind of what you hear a lot nowadays is that we're still here, which is a testament to the fact that their ability to persevere in the face of just the enormous one disease killed most, but almost every Indian battle was almost always a massacre of Indians and not the other way around. And the fact that we can't change history. All we can do is understand it and resolve to do better in the future. Hopefully we can all live together in harmony with respect for cultures. I guess that's all I got to say.
Well, Sam, thank you for doing this today and all that you and your team do for events like this. The upcoming one that was announced for December 7th is going to be done for maintaining this great Navy Museum of the United States Navy and the 10 other museums around the country that we have honoring our naval hero. I'm so glad that I get to correspond with you on a regular basis and get my hard history questions, and you've got people over here that can dig in and find things. So thank you for having me.
Thanks. Thank you, sir.